Another month has passed us by. That means it's time to stop and rank all 8 May new movie releases that I saw from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Let me know your ranking of the May movies that you saw. Likewise, which of these movies do I need to rethink my opinion on? One more thing before we get started. If you don't know, I started a second channel back in January called Sean Chandler Plus, where I just cover more movies and TV. Here on the main channel, I typically cover kind of big, mainstream, broad appeal franchises. So then on the other channel, I try to cover smaller films, older TV shows, stuff that's a little bit more niche, that doesn't have quite as much of a broad appeal to it. If you enjoy my content and want more, be sure to check that out wherever that link is at. And let's get started. Coming in last place is Above Suspicion. This is the story of an FBI agent and his relationship with one of his informants and the consequences of that relationship, and it's based off a real life story, an event that happened about 30 years ago, and the real life story is actually very interesting. I simply don't think the nature of it translates well into a movie, or at least it certainly didn't in the case of this film. There's plenty of talent here in front of and behind the camera, with Emilia Clarke in the lead, Philip Noyce as the director, but inherently, the lead characters are making terrible choices all throughout the entire movie, and so it's tough to relate to either one of them, root for either one of them, want either one of them to succeed. So you just see people make really bad choices, and it leads to a really bad outcome, but not really in the most compelling of ways. In fact, some of the most interesting stuff about the movie was during the credits, it starts showing interviews with real people that were involved in the investigation and everything like that. And that's what made the film a bit more interesting, but I simply couldn't root for these characters and the choices they were making, or the tone that they went with how their relationship plays out. It just didn't work for me. Number 7, The Woman in the Window, a movie with a fantastic cast where the end result is a totally forgettable, mediocre thriller in the vein of The Rear Window. What it does well is kind of put you in the perspective of the lead character who has some mental health issues, and it can play the scares of her condition really nicely. But the central narrative itself, the final twists, the final reveals, it just doesn't pay off all that well in the end. So you're on this journey waiting to figure out what's really been going on. And when you get there, you kind of go, okay, that wasn't really worth the journey. You had plenty of talent on display on screen, some nice little tricks, but this twist doesn't earn 90 minutes of my life, unfortunately. Next up, Those Who Wish Me Dead, and another pretty big disappointment. In the case of this one, it's essentially because Tyler Sheridan wrote and directed the film, and over the last few years, he's written Sicario, Hell or High Water, as well as Wind River, and he directed Wind River, and those were all very solid thrillers, and this one just felt so conventional. It's a throwback kind of 90s person on the run, a protagonist who's down on their luck, dealing with tragedy that has to help someone, and it kind of pulls them out of the funk that they're in. It's a story we've seen many times before. I like these kind of movies, so I enjoyed this movie well enough. But considering Taylor Sheridan was behind the camera and you got like Angelina Jolie, John Berthal in front of the camera, you just expect it to be more, and it doesn't really elevate the material, doesn't have any extra layers of depth. It's just a solid little survival thriller. I like these kinds of movies, so I did enjoy it, but it wasn't nearly as good as what I know Tyler Sheridan can deliver. In 5th place, Cruella. This was another tricky one for me because I went in as someone that inherently, it's a tough sell to convince me to root for Cruella de Vil, the lady that goes on to want to skin puppies in order to make a coat. And to their credit, I think they did the best job that they could telling this lively story with lots of fashion twists and turns in the story about Cruella de Vil, but at its core, you either violate who Cruella de Vil is, or you try to make me root for someone that is not someone that I should be rooting for. And that was the inherent tension I had during the film. There's some lively situations. It actually has kind of a nice directorial flair to it. I had fun with the soundtrack and the 70s punk vibe that it had. But Cruella de Vil is a horrible, horrible, despicable person, not this misunderstood punk rock rebel tearing down the system.
Not a great plan.
So it's a movie whose premise is constantly at conflict with itself. Therefore, I was at conflict with its central premise. Likewise, it's a movie with a very narrow target audience. It's certainly not children. I don't think it's a lot of people my age. My running theory is that one's enjoyment of this film is directly proportional to the amount of time you've spent at Hot Topic in the last 10 years. At least that's my theory. I could be wrong. In fourth place, Spiral from the Book of Saw. After a few years away from the big screen, Saw returns with another soft reboot of the franchise, this time with Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson in the lead. And for me, I thought it was one of the better films in the franchise. Still, far from a great film, has some significant issues, but I thought it changed up the formula just enough, put the focus back on the investigation, the mysteries. Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson are inherently watchable, fun, charismatic leads. That also helps to elevate the material. Certainly, as you kind of get into the final moments and as the big twist turns and reveals, they were telegraphed way in advance. They don't pay off nearly as good as they should have. Certainly, franchise has seen better days. It doesn't have as much freshness and momentum as maybe it should have. But for me, compared to some of the sequels in this franchise, this was one of the better movies, at least from my perspective. Real quick before I give you my top three, remember to join me down below in the comments section. Let me see your ranking of the May movies that you saw, and let me know which of my opinions on here maybe you think I should rethink. What am I missing? I'd love to hear your take on it. Also, remember, I have that second channel, Sean Chandler Plus. Even some of the movies that I'm covering in this list, I reviewed over there, not on the main channel, because they're a little bit more niche, not quite fully on brand. And that's what I plan on doing moving forward. So be sure to follow over there if you're interested in more Sean Chandler. In third place, Army of the Dead. After 10 years of making DC movies, Zack Snyder returns to the genre of his original film, zombie movies, but combines it with the heist genre and sets it in Las Vegas, which on a pure premise level sounds awesome to me. Does the movie fully deliver on the promise of the premise? Not quite as good as I was hoping. Not quite as good as I think it could have been, and for fairly typical reasons that you'd expect from a Zack Snyder movie. The visuals are awesome. The action can be thrilling and exciting. He knows how to make vibrant, dynamic action sequences that put you in that setting and have interesting things taking place. Likewise, there's all sorts of stuff going on with the mythology that just makes it feel like a rich, lived-in world with a bunch of questions you're interested in finding an answer to, but don't necessarily need to be answered in this movie. At the same time, the movie's 2.5 hours long, and there's simply no reason for that. This is a movie that easily you could shave 30 minutes off of it, and it would just move at a nice, faster pace. There's a few too many plot lines kind of thrown into a basic premise. Like the idea of just a zombie heist movie works in and of itself, that you don't need to add the extra stuff into it that only detracts from the most interesting thing about the movie. So by the time you get to the end of it, it was like, it did a bunch of the things I wanted it to do, and then it just made some of those weird mistakes that you could imagine the better version of it, unfortunately.
We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close.
It's so close, but not quite there. Our runner-up, Wrath of Man, the latest Guy Ritchie, Jason Statham team-up. This one is a combination of a heist film with the revenge genre, and honestly, I just thought it worked really well. In a certain sense, it's a fairly straightforward story, simplistic inherently by nature. Certain elements are familiar, but by combining these two genres together and using some of Guy Ritchie's storytelling techniques where it's told out of order, kind of in the form of chapters that are not chronological, it just brings just enough freshness to it to make it interesting. Likewise, for a Guy Ritchie movie, this is a pretty serious film. It doesn't have his usual bag of tricks that he uses with the fast editing, the slow-mo, the winking at the camera, the one-liners. No, he just tells a serious, edge-of-your-seat revenge thriller with a heist element to it, and I thought that it absolutely worked.
I like it a lot.
But easily coming in first place is A Quiet Place 2. Now, for me, just being able to see this movie in the theater was a triumph in and of itself, because I was a couple days away from seeing the press screening last year when the whole world kind of started crumbling down. This movie got delayed, and this movie was the symbol to me of, oh no, this whole stuff going on in the world with the virus, this is a real deal that's going to change everything. So finally getting to see it in a packed theater and seeing how over this past weekend it was smashing current era box office records, just such a triumph and puts a smile on my face in and of itself. From there, the movie itself I thought was really good. It was the follow-up that I wanted and needed to the original film. The original film, very kind of small, self-contained story about this family. You don't see a lot of other people. You don't see a lot of the rest of the world. So what do you want in a sequel? Well, what happens next with this family, and what does the world look like? Let's meet some other people. Let's get a bigger, larger scale story. And it manages to do that, separates the family a little bit, but using intercutting and these editing techniques, it manages to keep the tension, keeps you on the edge of your seat. It still has that experience of the first film where you just feel a constant sense of danger while telling multiple different stories that feel connected, while they're not connected really at all in another sense. Likewise, they found a way to keep the emotional core with what they did with the Cillian Murphy character and kind of bringing him into the mix. It's a different emotional arc than what they were doing with the father in the first movie, but equally as satisfying as you pull it into the end of the film. At the end of the day, it delivered the thrills and the emotion of the original while telling a bigger story that expands the mythology and takes the characters to new places. So without question, it comes in at number 1. If you enjoyed this video and want more content like it, be sure to check out my other channel, Sean Chandler Plus, with more Sean Chandler content. Down below, I'll pin a comment with my links to all the reviews if you want my deeper thoughts on any of these movies. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.